Imagine waking up every morning not knowing if you'll live to see another sunset. Not because of war, not because of plague, but simply because you were born poor. In medieval Europe, poverty wasn't just about having less money or fewer luxuries. It was a death sentence written in the stars from the moment you took your first breath. Today, we're diving into one of history's most brutal realities, a world where your social class determined not just how you lived, but whether you lived at all. This is the horrifying truth about being poor in medieval Europe, and why millions of people were condemned to die simply for being born into the wrong family. Picture this. It's 1347, somewhere in rural England. A baby is born in a tiny windowless hovel made of mud and straw. The roof leaks, there's no heating, and the floor is nothing but packed dirt mixed with animal waste. This child, let's call him Thomas, has just entered the world with a 60% chance of dying before his 5th birthday. Not because of any disease or accident, but because he was born a serf. The feudal system wasn't just unfair, it was genocidal by design. At the top sat the king, then the nobles, then the knights, and at the very bottom, crushed under the weight of this human pyramid, were the serfs. These weren't just poor people, they were human property. They belonged to the land, and the land belonged to their lord. If the land was sold, they were sold with it, like livestock. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. This wasn't some accident of history. The system was deliberately designed to keep the poor in a state of perpetual near death. A serf who was too comfortable might start getting ideas. A serf who wasn't constantly fighting for survival might have time to think, to organize, to rebel. So the lords made sure that never happened. They calculated exactly how much food, shelter, and freedom to give their human property, just enough to keep them alive and working, but never enough to let them truly live. Thomas's father works from dawn to dusk, 6 days a week on his lord's land. On the 7th day, he's required to work his own tiny plot, the small strip of land that's supposed to feed his entire family. But here's the catch. Even from his own land, he owes a portion of his harvest to his lord, and another portion to the church as tithe. And if there's a bad harvest, well, the lord and the church still get their share first. What's left barely keeps the family alive, and that's in a good year. Let me paint you a picture of what barely alive actually meant in numerical terms, because the statistics are absolutely staggering. An average serf family needed about 2,000 calories per person per day just to survive, but their typical diet provided maybe 1,200 to 1,500 calories on a good day. During winter months or in bad harvest years, this could drop to 800 calories or less. To put this in perspective, that's less than what prisoners of war are supposed to receive under modern international law. But it gets worse. Their diet consisted almost entirely of a thin porridge made from whatever grain they could grow, usually oats or barley because wheat was too valuable and had to be given to the lord. This porridge provided calories, yes, but almost no protein, vitamins, or minerals. The result was a population of walking skeletons, perpetually malnourished, their bodies slowly consuming themselves to stay alive. Children were hit the hardest. Their growing bodies needed more nutrition, but they got less. A typical serf child was stunted, both physically and mentally, by chronic malnutrition. Their bones were soft and deformed. Their immune systems were so compromised that a simple cold could kill them. Women faced an even more horrific fate. Pregnancy and childbirth in a state of severe malnutrition was often a death sentence. Maternal mortality rates among serf women reached 20 to 25%. That means 1 in 4 women died giving birth. And if they survived, they were expected to immediately return to back-breaking labor, often while still bleeding from childbirth. The lords knew these numbers. They kept careful records of their human property, tracking births, deaths, and productivity like a modern factory tracks its machines. They knew that maintaining their serfs in a state of near starvation was the most economically efficient way to extract maximum labor while minimizing costs. This wasn't neglect. This was calculated, systematic murder by starvation stretched out over entire lifetimes. But malnutrition was just the beginning of the horror. The living conditions of the poor in medieval Europe were specifically designed to breed disease and death. Let's go back to Thomas's family hovel. It's about 12 feet by 16 feet, smaller than many modern bathrooms. In this space live Thomas, his parents, his 3 siblings, and often their pig and chickens too. The animals aren't pets. They're food sources too valuable to risk leaving outside where they might be stolen. There are no windows, because glass is a luxury only the rich can afford. The only light comes from the doorway and maybe a small hole in the roof that also serves as a chimney. But since fuel for fires is scarce, the house is usually cold and dark, the floor is packed earth mixed with straw, and it's never cleaned. It absorbs urine, feces, vomit, and rotting food scraps. Over time, this creates a toxic soup of bacteria and parasites. Everyone in the family walks barefoot on this contaminated surface, sleeps on it, eats food that falls on it. There's no toilet, people simply relieve themselves in a corner of the house or just outside the door. Human waste mixes with animal waste and rainwater to create festering pools of disease around every dwelling. But the water situation was perhaps the most deadly aspect of medieval poverty. The poor couldn't afford to live near clean water sources. Those were controlled by the lords for their mills and castles. Instead, serfs drew their water from contaminated wells, streams polluted with human waste, or stagnant ponds shared with animals. This water was literally teeming with deadly bacteria, parasites, and viruses. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and countless intestinal worms were constant companions of the poor. Chronic diarrhea was so common that it was considered normal. Most people lived in a permanent state of dehydration and intestinal distress. The mortality rates speak for themselves. In some serf communities, 40 to 50% of children died before age 10. The average life expectancy for a serf was around 25 to 30 years. Not because they aged faster, but because their bodies simply gave up under the constant assault of malnutrition and disease. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of medieval poverty was how the legal system was weaponized against the poor. This wasn't just about having expensive lawyers. The law itself was written to criminalize poverty and ensure that being poor was literally punishable by death. Let's say Thomas, now grown up and desperate to feed his starving family, steals a loaf of bread. Not gold, not jewels, just bread to keep his children from dying. The penalty? Death by hanging. But if a noble murdered a serf, the penalty might be a small fine, payable to the serf's lord for the loss of property. The courts were run by and for the nobility. There was no presumption of innocence for the poor, no right to defense, no appeal process. A serf accused of a crime was guilty until proven innocent, and they had no means to prove their innocence. But the legal system found even more creative ways to torment the poor. There were laws against begging, laws against traveling without permission, laws against learning to read, laws against gathering in groups. Essentially, every survival strategy available to the poor was criminalized. The most sadistic aspect was the concept of benefit of clergy. If you could read a passage from the Bible, you could claim benefit of clergy and receive a reduced sentence. But since the poor were forbidden from learning to read, this escape route was exclusively available to the rich and the church officials. Even more horrifying were the collective punishments. If one serf in a village committed a crime, the entire village could be punished. Crops could be destroyed, animals slaughtered, people evicted from their homes. This created a system where the poor were forced to police each other, reporting any suspected wrongdoing to avoid collective punishment. The stocks and pillory weren't just punishments. They were public humiliation designed to dehumanize the poor. A person locked in the pillory was at the mercy of anyone who wanted to throw stones, rotten food, or excrement at them. Many died from injuries sustained during their time in the pillory, and the authorities considered this an acceptable outcome. Perhaps no institution was more complicit in the systematic murder of the poor than the Catholic Church. While preaching about compassion and charity, the Church was one of the largest landowners in Europe and one of the most brutal exploiters of serf labor. The Church's message to the poor was as cynical as it was deadly. Blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the kingdom of heaven. Suffer in this life, obey your betters, and you'll be rewarded in the next life. It was the perfect psychological weapon to keep the poor docile while they were systematically worked to death. But the Church's hypocrisy went far deeper. While parish priests lived in luxury, eating meat daily and drinking wine, they collected tithes from families who were literally starving. A serf family might watch their children die of hunger while still being required to give 10% of their meager harvest to the Church. The Church also ran a protection racket around salvation. Want your sins forgiven? Pay the Church. Want to ensure your dead relatives aren't suffering in purgatory? Pay the Church. Want to baptize your baby? Pay the Church. Every major life event became an opportunity for the Church to extract money from people who had nothing. Even more horrifying was the Church's attitude toward charity. While they preached about helping the poor, church-run hospitals and charitable institutions were primarily for the wealthy who could afford to pay. The poor were turned away to die in the streets, while the Church hoarded vast wealth in gold, silver, and land. The Church also provided the ideological justification for the feudal system. They preached that social hierarchy was divinely ordained, that God wanted some people to be rich and others to be poor. Rebellion against your Lord wasn't just treason, it was sin against God himself. Monks lived in relative comfort behind monastery walls, eating regular meals and receiving medical care, while peasants starved just outside those same walls. The contrast was so stark that it borders on the surreal. Men who had taken vows of poverty living better than 90% of the population. If you really want to understand the horror of medieval poverty, you need to understand what winter meant for the poor. It wasn't just cold. It was an annual genocide that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. As autumn faded, poor families faced an impossible calculation. They had to make their food stores last until the next harvest, 7 to 8 months away. But they also needed fuel to keep from freezing to death. In most cases, they couldn't afford both. Families were forced to choose which children to keep warm and which to let freeze. Parents made the agonizing decision to give their food to the children, most likely to survive, while watching their weaker children slowly waste away. The psychological torture was as brutal as the physical suffering. Mothers held their dying babies, knowing they had food that could save them, but also knowing that using that food meant their other children would die later. Fathers sold themselves into debt bondage just to buy a few more days of food for their families, knowing they were condemning themselves to a lifetime of even worse poverty. Many families simply abandoned their weakest members. Elderly grandparents were turned out into the snow to die. Disabled children were left in the forest. It wasn't cruelty, it was a desperate attempt to save whoever could be saved. The mortality rates during bad winters were staggering. In the winter of 1315 to 1316, known as the Great Famine, between 10 to 15% of Europe's population died. Entire villages were abandoned. Survivors resorted to cannibalism, eating the bodies of their dead neighbors, and sometimes even their own family members. Perhaps nowhere was the brutality of medieval poverty more evident than in the treatment of poor children. These weren't just unfortunate circumstances. Society was structured to ensure that poor children suffered and died. A serf child began working around age 5 or 6, not light chores, back-breaking agricultural labor alongside the adults. Their small hands were useful for certain tasks, and their lords saw no reason to waste this resource on frivolous things like education or play. Child mortality wasn't just high, it was expected. Parents named their children after dead siblings because they assumed some wouldn't survive. Having 8 or 10 children in hopes that 2 or 3 might reach adulthood was the norm. Poor children had no legal protections whatsoever. They could be sold, traded, or killed by their lords with no legal consequences. A lord who worked a child to death faced the same penalty as a modern person who breaks a tool. They just had to replace it. Education was forbidden to serf children. Learning to read was considered a privilege of the nobility, and any attempt to educate poor children was seen as dangerous to the social order. A literate serf might start getting ideas above their station. The most heartbreaking aspect was that children often died just as they reached the age where they could contribute meaningfully to their family's survival. A boy who survived childhood diseases and malnutrition might die at 14 or 15, just when his labor could have helped his family escape the worst poverty. What made medieval poverty so devastating wasn't just cruel individuals. It was a system economically designed to extract maximum value from human suffering. The lords had calculated exactly how much misery was profitable. A serf who was too comfortable might demand better conditions or try to leave. A serf who was too miserable would die and need to be replaced. The sweet spot was keeping people in a state of constant desperation, alive enough to work, desperate enough to never rebel. The economic logic was ruthlessly efficient. Why invest in better housing for serfs when they would work just as hard living in hovels? Why provide better food when malnutrition made them more docile? Why offer education when ignorance made them easier to control? Even the timing of when serfs were allowed to marry was calculated for maximum economic benefit. Lords controlled when their serfs could reproduce, ensuring a steady supply of new workers while preventing population growth that might lead to demands for better conditions. The most cynical aspect was how the system created artificial scarcity. There was enough land, enough food, enough resources for everyone to live decent lives. But concentrating all resources in the hands of a few while keeping the majority in desperate poverty served the lord's interests. When we look back at medieval Europe, we're not just studying ancient history. We're examining one of humanity's most systematic experiments in organized cruelty. For nearly 1,000 years, European society was structured around the principle that some human lives were worthless. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that over the course of the medieval period, tens of millions of people died premature deaths due to the conditions of poverty, deaths that were entirely preventable with the resources available at the time. These weren't victims of natural disasters or unavoidable tragedies. They were murdered by a system that valued their labor more than their lives, that found their suffering profitable, and that used religion and law to justify the unjustifiable. Thomas, the baby we imagined at the beginning of this video, probably died before his 30th birthday. If he was lucky, it was from disease or malnutrition. If he was unlucky, it was from the Lord's justice system, executed for the crime of trying to survive. His children, if he had any, faced the same fate, and their children after them. generation after generation, condemned to die for the crime of being born poor. The next time someone romanticizes the good old days or talks about how simple life was in medieval times, remember Thomas. Remember the millions like him who lived and died in misery so that a few could live in luxury. Because being poor in medieval Europe wasn't just hard, it was a death sentence that lasted a lifetime.